Have you ever taken a picture with the camera and it just didn't turn out how you wanted it to? This is oftentimes the case when using preset modes on a camera, such as an indoor or outdoor mode, a mode for moving objects, or whatever it may be. If you want to pick up photography as a hobby or even possibly as a profession, then shooting in manual mode is a very beneficial skill to learn and opens up a lot of opportunities. Manual mode allows you to decide how the camera shoots and works every time you take a photograph. Arguably, the most important thing to adjust in manual mode is the exposure triangle, and today I'm going to talk about each spectrum of that triangle: the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. To begin, the ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. When adjusting this, you must look at available lighting around you and adjust accordingly. The ISO is different for every camera and brand, but it typically starts around 100 and increases to 200, 400, 800, 1200, etc. So, how do you choose the correct ISO for each situation that you're shooting in? Because it's your camera's sensitivity to light, on a bright, sunny day, you would choose a very low ISO, such as ISO 100. Alternatively, if you moved indoors or it became darker outside, you would increase your ISO to compensate for that change in light to maybe ISO 400 or ISO 800. Adjusting the ISO is a great way to compensate in low light situations to avoid using flash, and it's oftentimes the thing that you will adjust the least. A seasoned photographer will typically adjust this first, but be wary because if you adjust the ISO too high, it may add more noise to your photograph or impurities to your photograph and make it get this sort of like grainy look to it. The next thing you'll need to adjust is the aperture of your lens, or the f-stop. The aperture is not governed by your camera but by the lens itself. For example, I have two lenses here. Following the focal length or the magnification on the lens is a number. This one is 1 to 4 and this one is 1 to 1.4. That is your maximum aperture or the maximum width that your lens can open. The aperture varies how much light enters into your camera through your lens. However, it is kind of the opposite that you would think. A low aperture or f-stop is a very wide open lens, and alternatively a large aperture will provide a very small opening, a very narrow lens, which would allow less light into the lens. For example, an aperture of 1.4 would look like this, like a very wide open lens, whereas an aperture of maybe 18, with the same lens, you just adjusted the f-stop differently, would be very narrow, like a small hole like this. Another thing to look into as well is how the aperture affects what is in focus in your photograph. A low aperture will focus nicely on an object and will provide a lot of background blur, whereas a large aperture will put more in focus, such as like a big thing, like a big group picture, so you make sure everyone's face is in focus. The final thing that you need to adjust when addressing the exposure triangle is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is the amount of time your camera is open and is the main tool for adjusting the proper exposure. If you have a slow shutter speed, like maybe 1/80th of a second, more light will enter into your camera. If you have a shutter speed that's really fast, like 1/800th of a second, it will allow less light into the camera and it will capture action much better. So, if you take a picture and it is too dark, you may want to decrease your shutter speed to allow more light to enter into the camera. Typically, when you're walking around taking pictures, the ISO and the aperture will stay relatively the same. The shutter speed, however, will vary depending on how much light you want to enter the camera and what kind of shot that you're taking. So, when attempting to take pictures for the first time in manual mode, remember the exposure triangle. First, adjust the ISO, your camera's sensitivity to light, then adjust the aperture of your lens, how wide or narrow your lens will be, allowing more or less light into the camera, and also keep in mind the depth if you want things more in focus or you want a lot of background blur. And finally, fine-tune your shutter speed, the amount of time that your shutter will be opening, allowing more or less light in. I hope this information has been beneficial to you. It takes a lot of practice, but once you get the hang of it, you won't even think about it, you'll just do it. Happy shooting.